I'm going to take a quick guess here. I'm going to put money on the fact you're not new to business. You've listened to the podcasts, read the books, maybe even worked with coaches or mentors before. You understand the theory, you're not afraid of doing the work. And yet there's a part of you that keeps wondering why it still feels harder than it should. Why things that look successful from the outside don't always feel sustainable on the inside. Why you can be capable, committed, and doing so many things right and still feel stretched, reactive, or quietly frustrated. If that sounds familiar, you're exactly who this episode is for. Because over the last 17 episodes of this podcast, we've talked about a lot of individual pieces. Numbers, strategy, planning, leadership, systems, growth. And they all matter. But when they're taken in isolation, it's easy to miss the bigger picture. So today, I want to do something different. I want to zoom right out and show you how all of this actually fits together. Not as a to-do list or a set of rules to follow, but as a pattern you can recognize yourself inside. This episode is here to give you a high-level understanding of the Thrive Without Sacrifice blueprint, explain why the blueprint exists, and help you see a different way of building a business. One that supports your life, evolves with you, and doesn't require constant sacrifice to be successful. And if, as you're listening, you feel a sense of relief rather than pressure, that's not accidental. It's a sign that you're not broken. You've just been trying to build something meaningful without anyone ever showing you the whole system. I want to start with something personal, because this blueprint didn't come from a clever framework, exercise, or a whiteboard session where I decided to invent something new. It came from years of sitting alongside smart, capable business owners. People who were doing so many things right and watching them quietly assume they were the problem when things still felt harder than they should. Different industries, different business models, different definitions of success. But the same conversations kept repeating. Cash flow stress, even in businesses that were technically profitable. Plans that looked solid on paper but somehow never translated into momentum in real life. Founders who'd built something impressive but felt trapped inside it, exhausted, over-responsible, and constantly behind. For a long time, I held all of this knowledge in pieces. There was the numbers work, which we explored early in the podcast when we talked about resetting foundations and understanding what your numbers are really telling you. There was strategy and planning, the conversations about vision, mapping moves, and building momentum. There were leadership and systems conversations that came later once people were already stretched thin. Individually, these conversations were helpful. Collectively, something was missing. The moment it clicked for me was realizing that these weren't separate problems requiring separate fixes. They were part of a predictable system, a set of stages that businesses move through again and again as they grow, change, and evolve. Once I could see that clearly, everything shifted. Not just how I worked with clients, but how I explained what was happening. Instead of people feeling like outliers or failures, they could see themselves inside a pattern. And that realization alone was often enough to take the pressure off. This blueprint is the culmination of that understanding. It exists to say very clearly, you are not broken, you are not behind, and you are not uniquely bad at business. The challenges you're facing are common. They're contextual and they're solvable. Now, before we talk about the blueprint itself, we need to address the backdrop most of us are operating against. Hustle culture has shaped the way we think about success for years, often without us even realizing it. It tells us that if something feels hard, the solution is usually to push harder, to be more disciplined, to want success badly enough that everything else becomes secondary. The problem is, effort on its own doesn't create alignment. In fact, effort without clarity often creates exhaustion. One of the themes we've come back to again and again in this podcast, particularly in episodes like From Hustle to Alignment, is that grinding through misalignment doesn't magically turn it into success. It actually just burns people out faster. Hustle culture also ignores two critical realities. First, businesses move through seasons. What's required of you in the early stages of a business is very different from what's required when the business is established or when life circumstances change. Strategy that works in a growth season can feel suffocating in a consolidation season. Advice that assumes constant expansion leaves no room for rest, recalibration, or choice. Second, humans have limits. Capacity is not a mindset issue. Energy is not infinite, and yet so much business advice is built on the assumption that you can simply optimize yourself into having more. When strategy ignores seasons and capacity, even good ideas become sources of stress. People don't just burn out, they internalize failure. They assume they are the problem rather than questioning the model they're trying to operate inside. The Thrive Without Sacrifice blueprint is a direct response to this. It is built on the idea that success without sustainability isn't success at all, and that a business should feed your life, not consume it. At its core, the Thrive Without Sacrifice blueprint is made up of 3 milestones and 9 core strategies. You'll hear me talk about milestones rather than steps, quite intentionally. This isn't a ladder you climb once and never revisit. It's a system you cycle through at different levels as your business and life evolve. Each milestone supports a different kind of decision-making, and each strategy inside it addresses a pattern that shows up again and again. So milestone number 1 is master your numbers. We talked about this extensively in the early episodes of the podcast, starting with resetting foundations and understanding why numbers matter more than most people think. This milestone is where everything begins, not because numbers are exciting, but because they're honest. Reset foundations is about getting clear on what's actually happening in your business, rather than operating on assumptions or outdated information. For many people, this is confronting, but it's also where relief starts. Optimized cash flow shifts the focus away from revenue at all costs and towards sustainability. We explored this when we talked about cash flow as a strategic tool, not just an accounting exercise. A business that looks successful on paper but feels stressful day to day is often misaligned at a structural level. And then the final strategy, Unlock Insights, is when numbers stop being something you avoid and start becoming something you use. They give you context for decisions, confidence in your direction, and language for what needs to change. This milestone isn't about control or restriction. It's about creating enough clarity that you can stop guessing and start choosing. Now, milestone number 2 is build your game plan. Once you understand where you are, the next question becomes, what do I do with this information? This is where many business owners get stuck, which is why we spent so much time across episodes talking about vision, planning, and momentum. The first strategy, Craft Your Playbook, is about defining how you do business, not how you've been told you should, and not what worked for someone else in a completely different season or context. Map Your Moves is where strategy becomes practical. It's about making intentional decisions rather than reactive ones, and understanding which moves matter now, not someday. And lastly, Drive Momentum is often misunderstood. It's not about doing more, it's about creating progress that compounds without requiring burnout. In earlier episodes, we talked about planning that actually gets done. This is where that idea lives. This milestone bridges the gap between knowing and doing, and when it's missing, even the best insights never translate into meaningful change. The last milestone is Create Your Dream Life. This milestone is often the most aspirational and the most misunderstood. It's not about building an empire or scaling for the sake of scale. It's about choice, leadership, and designing a business that can support the life you actually want to live. Lead Like a CEO is an identity shift we explored when we talked about stepping out of constant doing and into intentional leadership, even, but especially, for solo operators. Systemize Like a Pro is about building support into the business so everything doesn't rely on you. Systems aren't about rigidity, they're about freedom. And lastly, Amplify Growth is growth that feels expansive rather than extractive. Growth that creates more space, not more pressure. This milestone is where freedom stops being a vague desire and becomes something you can intentionally design for. Now, this is the part I really want you to hear, especially if you've ever felt like you're doing something wrong because things that used to work suddenly don't anymore. The blueprint is not something you move through once, tick off, and never come back to. It's not linear, and it's definitely not a pass-fail system. It's actually cyclical. What that means in real life is this. Every time your business changes, you change, or your life circumstances change, you're naturally invited back into a different part of the blueprint. When you're starting out, mastering your numbers might feel like the hardest thing in the world. Later on, it might be leadership or systems that feel sticky. Then, a year or two down the track, you might find yourself right back at the foundations again. Not because something went wrong, but because the business has grown and the old structure no longer fits. That's not failure, that's growth. One of the most damaging ideas hustle culture has sold us is that if you were good at business, things would just get easier over time. But in reality, what happens is that problems change. They become more nuanced, more contextual, more tied to identity and choice rather than pure survival. This is why people so often feel blindsided. They think, I should be past this by now, when actually they're right on time for the next iteration. The Thrive Without Sacrifice blueprint gives you language for that. It helps you understand whether the discomfort you're feeling is coming from a lack of clarity, a lack of structure, a lack of capacity, or a misalignment between the business you've built and the life you're trying to live now. And once you can see that, you stop making it mean something about your worth, your discipline, or your ambition. You stop asking, what's wrong with me, and start asking, what does this season actually require? That shift alone is incredibly freeing. Thrive Without Sacrifice exists because I kept watching capable people try to apply good ideas in isolation, and then blame themselves when it didn't stick. They'd understand their numbers but still feel reactive. They'd have a plan but no capacity to execute it. They'd build momentum only to realize the business now relied entirely on them to keep going. Nothing was wrong with them. The problem was that they were trying to hold everything at once, without any kind of container to support it. This is where most programs fall down. They assume that if you just give people enough information, motivation, or accountability, everything will click. But information without integration just becomes noise. And accountability without context often turns into pressure. Thrive Without Sacrifice was designed as a different way of working. One that respects the fact that you're a human first and a business owner second. It's a space where the blueprint isn't something you rush through, but something you work with over time, where numbers, strategy, leadership, systems, and growth are held together instead of being treated as separate problems you need to solve one by one. It also deliberately makes room for seasons. There are times when your focus needs to be on stabilizing, times when it makes sense to push, times when life takes precedence and the business needs to support you rather than demand more. Thrive Without Sacrifice isn't about keeping you moving at a constant pace. It's about helping you move intentionally with clarity, self-trust, and sustainability. At its core, it's about helping you build a business that you don't need to escape from. If you've listened all the way through, there's a good chance something has quietly clicked. Maybe it's seeing your business challenges as part of a pattern rather than a personal failure. Maybe it's recognizing that you've outgrown the way you've been working. Or maybe it's simply the relief of hearing that it's allowed to be done another way. And this is where I want to reintroduce an idea that sits underneath everything you've heard today. And that's Thrive by Design. Thrive by Design isn't a program, and it's not a destination you arrive at once and tick off. It's a philosophy. A way of thinking about business that starts with the assumption that your business should be intentionally designed to support the life you want to live, not built on default settings, external expectations, or someone else's version of success. It means recognizing that businesses don't accidentally become sustainable, spacious, or supportive. Those qualities are designed, chosen, and revisited. It also means accepting that what you need to design for will change over time. There are seasons where stability matters more than growth, seasons where leadership needs to evolve, seasons where capacity is limited and the business needs to adapt around that rather than demand more from you. Thriving by Design doesn't ignore those realities. It plans for them. This is where the Thrive Without Sacrifice blueprint comes in. The blueprint is the structure that allows you to thrive by design rather than by accident. It gives you a way to understand what your business needs now, why certain things feel hard at particular stages, and which strategies will actually support you without asking you to sacrifice yourself in the process. And Thrive Without Sacrifice is the way that the blueprint is brought to life. It's the practical expression of this philosophy, a container where the milestones and strategies aren't rushed or treated as a checklist, but worked through in a way that respects your season, your capacity, and your definition of success. This isn't about fixing you. It's about designing your business more intentionally. So what do you do next? Honestly, nothing dramatic. The most meaningful next step is simply to sit with the idea of thriving by design and notice where your current business setup supports you and where it quietly works against you. If you're curious to explore this more deeply, you're invited to take a look at Thrive Without Sacrifice and see how the blueprint is applied in practice. Not with pressure or urgency, but with structure, clarity, and support. And even if you don't take that step right now, I hope this episode has given you something more valuable than another tactic. And that's permission. Permission to stop forcing yourself into a model that doesn't fit. Permission to let your business evolve as your life evolves. Permission to believe that it's possible to thrive, not by chance, not by hustle, but by design. You're not behind, you're not broken, and you are absolutely allowed to do this differently.